Good evening. On behalf of the New York Society Library, welcome to the very first event of our fall season. We're pleased to be presenting a range of events about fiction, history, and more, most of it live streaming just like this, with limited in-person audiences in the building beginning in October. You can take a look at our website for full listings. I am Sarah Elliott Holliday, head of events, and I'm just here briefly to mention that and a word about tonight's speakers. To begin with, I have here book plates, beautifully signed by Hilma Wolitzer, and we're happy to send you one free of charge to add to your copy of Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket or any of her other books. I will pop my email address in the chat in just a moment. Please drop us a line and we'll send that along. We do encourage you to buy the book from our independent friends at the corner bookstore, and that link is also in the chat, or will be in a moment. Please also add your own questions and comments to the chat. I think you've mostly found it, but it's at the right of your screen throughout the evening, and the authors will address them later in the program. Meg Wolitzer's writing has been described as wonderfully wise, true to life, engrossing, ultra-readable. Her many notable novels include The Female Persuasion, The Interestings, The 10-Year Nap, The Position, and The Wife, plus fiction for young readers such as To Night Owl from Dogfish. We're particularly pleased and honored to have Meg in discussion with other great fiction writers this year. If you didn't see her May event with Kirsten Valdez-Quaid, it is available to stream from our website. Hilma Wolitzer is the author of the novels In the Palomar Arms and An Available Man, among many others, and nonfiction including The Company of Writers. Her brand new short story collection, Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket, collects and enhances short stories originally published in magazines in the 1960s and 1970s. It has been named a Kirkus must-read fiction book, a Time magazine New Books You Should Read in August, and People magazine Book of the Week. And really wonderfully, Gail Godwin said of it, "To read Hilma Wolitzer is to laugh in a special way and to allow yourself little intermissions of sheer satisfaction in which you lay the open book face down on your heart and snuggle with the human race." Now, please enjoy this conversation with Hilma Wolitzer and Meg Wolitzer.
Hi, thank you so much, Sarah. Hello, Mother.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine.
So I love this idea that we are in conversation, which is something that we would be doing anyway, even if we weren't doing it here at the library tonight.
We don't need
I love that. No, we don't need a telephone. Before we get into it, I would love to ask you to kind of do a little bit of a sort of amuse-bouche, a little brief reading from the book. And can you set it up a little bit? Tell us what we're hearing?
Yes. I'm going to read a little bit from the final story in the collection, the only new story in the collection. And they bring us up to date on some characters here in earlier stories. We first meet them when they're very young, they fall in love, she becomes pregnant, they get married in that order, and they have children, their parents die, and they grow old. And this story brings us into their old age and the age of COVID. And the story is called The Great Escape, and I'm only going to read the opening passage. I used to look at Howard first thing in the morning to see if he was awake too, and if he wanted to get something going before one of the kids crashed into the room and plopped down between us like an Amish bundling board. Lately, though, with the children long grown and gone to their own marriage beds, I found myself glancing over to see if Howard was still alive, holding my breath while I watched for the shallow rise and fall of his, the way I had once watched for a promising rise in the bedclothes. Whenever I saw that he was breathing and that the weather waited just behind the blinds to be let in, I felt an irrational surge of happiness. Another day, and then another, and another, and another. Breakfast, vitamins, bills, argument, blood pressure pills, lunch, doctor, cholesterol medicine, the telephone, supper, TV, sleep pills, sleep, waking. It seemed as if it would all go on forever in that exquisitely boring and beautiful way. Of course it wouldn't. Everyone knows that.
Thank you. That was great. So just for readers who don't know this, in the story, in the book, there are several stories that involve these two characters, Paulette and Howard. And this is the last one. When you started writing them, you didn't know that you were going to do all of these stories about the characters.
I did one sentence at a time. I didn't even know that I'd have a whole story when I began. They just entered my head and they just stayed there. And I often say they should be paying rent because they've lived in my head so long.
Yeah, it's really been a long time. So the first ones were from the 70s, and now we follow this character and this marriage almost in real time through to the present day. I know the answer to this question, so I'm setting you up here, but I think readers and viewers really will want to know how the collection came to be.
You are responsible for it, my dear daughter. My husband and I both contracted COVID at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were hospitalized in separate hospitals. He became ill first. I followed shortly afterward. And then he died of COVID 2 days before I was released from the hospital. And after I came home, and of course, it was a very strange situation where none of us could see each other, none of us could comfort each other, none of us could comfort him, no one saw him off, and here we all were separate. And then Meg called me and said that she had an idea putting together a collection of my old short stories. And at first I wasn't interested at all. I wasn't feeling well, and I was in mourning, I was grieving, and the whole thing just didn't interest me at all. But she also petitioned my agent about it, and the two of them began to persuade me. And after a while, I realized that I needed something to do besides grieve, and I needed something to look forward to. I think everybody always needs something to look forward to. Even at 91, you do. And I began to put the stories together, to read them. But even after I put them together, I realized that I wanted to do something new. And though the stories were not, the earliest stories were not autobiographical, I tried to avoid that and to protect our privacy. I realized that I had to write something about the experience that my husband and I went through, being ill and losing him. And that I still wanted it to be fiction. So, of course, I changed some of the details, and I also assigned the experience to fictional characters, to Paulette and Howard. So it's telling all the truth, but telling it slant.
What does writing do, though? I mean, it's hard to put it into words, isn't it? Like that when we have an idea or a deep feeling, we just want to write. What do you think that is? Is it about making meaning of something just
I have
surreal?
No idea. It's all so mysterious. Well, you may work from ideas, and I think your novels do have more big ideas than mine do. I just work from characters, and the characters enter my consciousness and start to tell me the story. So when I begin, I really don't know where I'm going. It's not exactly driving blind, but it's like driving at night with sunglasses on. I have a vague idea of where I'm going, but I can only see a few feet ahead, a few sentences ahead. And unfortunately, when you don't have a grand plan, it sometimes just is out. Nothing happens. I always said that Joseph Heller wrote the novel Something Happened, and I would write the novel called Nothing Happened, because I've abandoned as much as 150 pages of a novel. But then writers are thrifty, and a few of the sentences that have been abandoned become useful in future projects.
I would read a book that you wrote called Nothing Happened.
How much pay you to do that.
I did an event here at the library some years ago with Elizabeth Strout, who in fact wrote the foreword to your collection. And I asked, it was about character. It was in the members' room. I remember it really well. And we were talking about the different ways we arrived at character. And she said something about when she was writing Olive Kitteridge, all she knew was that she saw a very large woman standing by a picnic table. And it's just the mystery of writing, to trust, to go with that, an image. And I think you're similar, right?
I
You just
remember
have an image.
Paulette with a line, and the line was in the first person. It was, "I am bigger than life." And I wasn't sure what I meant, but as a tall person of my generation, I was 5'9". I was always at the end of every line. I was taller than all the boys in school until they had a growth spurt. I felt big. I wasn't overweight, except in a few times in my life, but not then. And I just felt big. And I also felt optimistic, almost incorrigibly optimistic. And no matter what happened, I mean, I grew up during the Depression, and these weren't the most cheerful years for a family that was financially strapped. But I gleaned some optimism within the family. So certainly there was a great deal of laughter all the time. And they were always telling stories. And I was lying under the kitchen table listening to them. And I think that too was a beginning for me as a writer.
Well, I wanted to ask you about your beginnings because for me, I grew up in a house with a lot of books and with a mother who was becoming a writer in real time, in front of me, really, because your first short story came out in 1966 in the old Saturday Evening Post. And I can't tell you how exciting that was to me. I don't think I'd heard of the Saturday Evening Post. And there was a picture of Hemingway on the cover. And it said Papa. And I thought, oh, it's an issue devoted to papas. I mean, I remember just not understanding anything, but feeling this enormous pride about you and your story. But you grew up in a very, very different household. Talk a little bit about that. It
was not a literary household. There weren't a lot of books. There was an ancient set of encyclopedia, which I dipped into from time to time when I learned to read. And there was Dr. Morris Fishbine's Home Medical Advisor, with all those wonderful overlays of all the human organs, which was fascinating. And I became a hypochondriac before I became a writer.
But when did you know you had talent? Talk about how that came to be as an idea.
I began writing really bad poetry as a child. And then this amazing thing happened. My mother went to school for a parent-teacher conference. I believe I was in the 4th grade. The teacher's name was Miss Fredericks. And teachers were revered in my household. And I think in that period, if you met a teacher on the street, it was like seeing Brad Pitt. I mean, the teacher was a celebrity in our lives and also had a lot of authority and influence. And my mother came home from the parent-teacher conference glowing and reported to my father that Miss Fredericks had said, "Hilma shows great promise." And I think my parents began to take those terrible poems, most of them, and they played cards several nights a week. And suddenly I was invited to recite my poems to the card players. Really couldn't wait to get to the next hand, but they applauded politely. And I went to bed thrilled with all the attention. I was the middle child, 3 daughters. So I think I was seeking attention. And I was just so happy about this. Flash forward 50 years. I'm now a writer. I'm published. And I'm giving a reading in a library in New Jersey. And after the reading is over, a very little, very old woman comes up to me and says, "Hilma, you don't recognize me, do you? I'm Miss Fredericks. I was your 4th grade teacher." I was so stunned, I just began to gush, thanking her for jump-starting my life as a writer. I said, Miss Fredericks, you did the most wonderful thing. You told my mother that I had great promise, that I showed great promise. And she said, oh, honey, I told that to all the mothers. That was in my place.
Well, no, but I love that story, and it stuck. Whatever it was stuck. So let's flash back a little bit to when, but somewhere between Brooklyn and when Miss Frederick showed up.
I had never
so you started writing, and you didn't know any writers, right?
It was a wonderful library, which we used all the time. We were wonderful library patrons, but I had never met a writer except through the books I read. And sometimes when you read a book, you feel almost as if you know the writer, or you wish you knew the writer. I did.
But you didn't go, and you didn't go to college.
No, I
so
graduated from high school.
Those experiences
16.
in
I went
those
to a
kind
very
of classes.
tough high school in a tough neighborhood. Maurice Sendak was in the same graduating class. He was 2 years older. And we even sat next to each other in major art. And I think both of us couldn't wait to get out of there. And years later, many years later again, we shared an editor. And I said to him, Maurice, you and I graduated and everybody else was sent up the river, which he thought was very funny and true.
Yeah. So you didn't know any writers, but you started writing, and your workshop, creative writing workshop that
Tremendous.
you took,
I mean,
had a huge influence on your life. Tell people about that experience.
You. And I decided to try to get into a beginner writing workshop at the New School given by Anatole Broyard. And I showed up to an overcrowded classroom. And sure enough, they asked me to read my story aloud first. We had all submitted stories in, and obviously, I don't think it was too discriminating because there were so many of us. And he asked me to come to the front of the room and read my story aloud. And I was very shy in those days, and it was embarrassing because he asked me to set my thumb first, and I had no place to put it, so I put it into my purse. And I went to the front of the room, and I read the story hyperventilating while I was reading it, and without any affect whatsoever, and then sank back into my seat. And Anatole called on the class, would anybody like to comment on this story? And a man raised his hand very languidly and said, that was the most boring thing I've ever heard. So that was the first response I'd ever had to something I'd written. And I was ready to pack it in, to just go home and make Jell-O molds and Halloween costumes and birthday cakes and forget about being a writer. And Anatole slipped me a note saying the story was fine and that I should see him later, but he also told my critic that it was all right for him to say he didn't like the story, but he had an obligation to tell me why and what he might do or what I might do to make it better. And in that moment, I learned about revision and teaching, the honesty and charity that teaching requires. And when I saw Anatole later, he transferred me to an advanced class where he had me read the story again. And they didn't like it either. But they gave me constructive criticism. So it didn't set me back. I went forward.
And you were reading a lot at that time, right? You were reading contemporary fiction. I remember the bookshelves in our den were filled with all kinds of new novels.
Or the year
in that
before,
amazing era.
The Catcher in the Rye came out. Ellison's Invisible Man. Styron's Lie Down in Darkness. And we were devouring these books. And since I hadn't had a formal education in high school, I hadn't read as much as I should have. And I don't think I'll ever catch up.
You know, actually, I see in the chat, there's a note from Hope Cook who says, Hilma, you visited the writing class Anatole was giving in on the Upper West Side, and in another class later on, he told us how much he liked your work.
He was very
a fan.
supportive.
So,
but he was also critical.
Just so you know, Anatole told others about your work
valid,
in other classes.
And it was helpful.
Now,
and when you teach writing, and I've done that a lot since then myself, you have to help the student, the writer, find what's good in the manuscript. It's easy enough to find what's wrong with it and to say that was the most boring sentence I ever read and so forth. But what if you can find the one good sentence in a story? And the writer had no idea it was a good sentence. And suddenly he recognizes where his strengths are, or her strengths are, and capitalizes on that.
Yeah, I know that you've been incredibly important to your students over the years, who've included Michael Cunningham, among other writers.
Oh, of course you are.
Did
and
you
also,
get a lot from teaching too? Was like the actors saying those things out loud? Are you saying them to yourself
I had to
too?
read their work aloud as well. I took that model from the class at the New School, but I never spoke first. I spoke last, or perhaps the writer spoke last, but I was the penultimate speaker, and I listened to the way other people read and heard the stories and assessed them. And I learned from them as well. And then when you have students who are as talented as Michael was, I was just blown away by these stories. Jane Ann Phillips was down the hall taking a class in Iowa with Frank Conroy. I mean, she was this young kid with a dog on a rope going to class. And it was all very exciting. And then after that, or sometime during that period, I began to go to Breadloaf. Actually, it was before then, because I went first as a scholar and then as a fellow. And then when my first novel came out, I was invited to come back and teach. And I did that for, I'm sorry. Right.
This is
in Middlebury, Vermont.
Let me just interrupt you. Breadloaf, your voice cut out there. So you're talking about the Breadloaf Writers Conference in Vermont.
That I had never met any writers before. Now I met more writers than I thought existed, and wonderful writers whose work I admired. And I was having breakfast with them and listening to them give lectures and readings and sitting in on other people's workshops. It was just an amazing experience. And I still have lifelong friends from that experience. Poet Paxton, for instance.
Well, because
yes,
writing is so solitary.
Thank goodness it lasted only 12 days.
When there's a chance for writers to get together and talk about writing, it can be really powerful, right?
With all that social life happening. I was too seduced by it. We use a lot of language in social encounters that we might have been saving for a story. And it went to home. You're alone, you're solitary when you're writing, but you're not really lonely, because your head is filled with characters and language and situations and stories. And it's an odd analogy, but I found that the company of writers when I was putting the collection together. This was a particularly lonely time because it was the time of COVID when we were all separated. I didn't share a meal with anybody for about 14 or 15 months, but I had characters in my head, and I always had books in front of me while I had my dinner so that I could have company.
So when you were looking through these stories, I always ask this question of people. If you look at your old work and you cover part of the page,
in looking at
do you
the
think
stories,
you'd be able to finish the sentence in a similar way that you had done all those years ago? Is the instinct still the same? To say a particular
thing hadn't changed, except that I might have been a little more self-conscious or formal in my writing then, fewer contractions, more adverbs. And I think, but I think there's a natural rhythm to the way you write. And probably I would say pretty much the same thing today. I found stories, this most recent story, which takes place, 50 years after, actually in fictional time, it takes place about 70 years, because the characters in the final story are approaching 90. They're younger than I am, but they're approaching 90. And their voices are the same to me. They're still themselves. It's a mystery.
It's such a strange thing, isn't it? That
well, if we didn't have readers, we'd
it's
be
a
writing
mystery,
to
but
ourselves.
I love that readers get it.
And at first we are writing.
You don't
to
have to be a
ourselves,
writer to get it, because
it's
before you're a writer,
readers.
you're
It's
a reader.
wonderful to share the experience with someone else, the experience of the novel, the short story. I find that readers my own age, what I wish for is that they would see, of my generation, a shock of recognition, that they would understand the experience that way. But I'm very thrilled that younger readers are responding to these very old stories, where there are no computers and there are no cell phones, but that human experience is human experience, no matter when it takes place.
Well, I know when the first copies of the book were sort of circulating at your publishing house, we heard that some of the young readers there really loved the stories, and I was just
it's
thrilled
embarrassing
to hear that.
In a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're a little shy.
So, did anything surprise you looking at them again? I mean,
but
it's difficult
I do remember
to look
writing
at work,
them,
isn't it?
and I remember the pleasure of putting words down on the page. When you're writing, no matter how ambitious you are as a writer, you don't think about an audience so much. You don't think about publication. You don't think about reviews just as well, perhaps. You don't think about readership. You don't think about anything but the characters and the story they're trying to tell you and you're trying to transcribe. And it is a mysterious business, because I'm not sure where they come from. And if I knew, I'd go back and get more characters.
Well, I don't know if you feel this way, but when I'm working,
you anymore. You're
I
out
feel
of
that
yourself.
it is the absolute anti-anxiety.
I forget how old I am
experience
until I pass a mirror.
It's just
and I
you
forget
and the
what
page.
time it is.
And
I sometimes go what Amy Tan said, that it's like going from dream to dream, that she wakes up and goes right to the writing implement and starts writing as if she had dreamed the story. And the same thing happens to me. I just go from dream to dream. Luckily, you can write in your pajamas. Nobody sees you. It's not the most glamorous job. And then suddenly it's dawn, perhaps, and the next thing you know, it's dark out. And you've been writing, you've gone to the bathroom a couple of times, you've had a glass of water and maybe some yogurt, but you're shocked at how much time has passed and how few pages you've done.
Well, but it must have been so intense when you wrote this story, The Great Escape, after Dad died, and it was, such a painful time in our family and in the world. But
well,
when you were writing that and you got caught up in the writing of it, it just felt
very
so
sunny character that Paulette is, who, despite everything, always finds something good. And perhaps she reflects me in a way. Maybe I'm insanely optimistic, given everything we all know. And in one of the stories, she said, her husband tends to be depressed. And she said, I know everything he knows. Why do I feel so happy? And it's a question I ask myself sometimes. But while I was writing that story, I can't say I felt very happy. I was reliving some of the experience of having COVID, of having Dad die of it, of coming home alone. In the story, my character is not hospitalized as I was, but she is facing the other side of the bed being empty. Her husband's clothes still in the closet, his toothbrush still in the toothbrush holder. And when I came home, I didn't use the same details because I felt, well, that's what a fiction writer does. You take the essence of it. But when I came out of the hospital, and it was 2 days after Dad died, and I was alone, the first thing I saw were his shoes next to the bed. And that just shocked me. And he had several pair of drugstore glasses because he was always misplacing them. So I kept finding them all over the house. And that was disturbing. And I remember putting them, and when I finally was given his cell phone, when his belongings from the hospital were sent home to me, I put them all into a bag to someday donate somewhere. And I still haven't done it. I have to find that bag and donate them somewhere, perhaps to a homeless shelter or somewhere. Yeah.
But you know, it's those details that you're describing that are just the kind of thing that a writer uses, as it were, even if you change it, right? I feel that the fiction that we love needs to get very specific. So let me ask you, I think people are interested. I'm still interested in this with writers I talk to about, I hate the word process.
Well, one of the things I do, and I've always advised students to do, is to read the work aloud.
What details to put in that aren't just sort of room
any
decoration?
False notes, anything, and any extraneous material, and any words that are there just to show off the little darlings that you're supposed to kill. And that's a very good method of weeding things out. But I find that there are writers like sculptors. There are sculptors who start with clay and build up. And there are sculptors who start with stone and chip away. And I started out as a visual artist, and I took sculpture classes at the Brooklyn Museum when I was very young. And I tried both things. And I found out that I was a builder, not a chipper away, because we had a piece of very soft stone, and I chipped and chipped until there was nothing but a pile of dust. I had no form. I did not see a form in this stone at all. But when I had clay and I could add to it and add to it, I began to see something emerge. And I think there are writers who overwrite and then cross things out. And there are writers like me who underwrite and then print out the page and start scribbling all over it, adding things, but erasing some of them, crossing out some of them. It's part of human experience.
In terms, I'm thinking about, is humor an add-on, or
grace
is that something
in
that
the
is part
darkest
of
times?
the clay?
I guess I learned this as a kid, listening to the grown-ups laughing in the dark days of the Great Depression, telling wonderful stories and finding them funny. Stories about being poor, about coming to the country and not speaking the language and being treated poorly by American citizens. And they laughed about it. And they made me see the bright side of darkness.
I think your books, all of your books, these short stories, even in a situation that's so dire and sad as in the last story, The Great Escape,
actually.
There's wit and humor throughout. I mean, do you try to get a balance, or is it? I mean, you are very, very funny. I mean, I truly. No. I beg to differ. We've had a lot of, funny moments where we've done things that will not be mentioned tonight.
And just being in an elevator together where there are other people, and suddenly feel the impulse
we're
to
not
laugh,
a mother-daughter writing team, but we have done some events and had some adventures together in which.
And you try to stifle this laugh. I mean, you and I both have the impulse to giggle a lot, and in our phone calls, we always find something to laugh at.
But I think that's true in your work, that, I mean, as I said, we're sort of lingering on the poignant and the difficult in that last story. But what knocks me out really about these stories, and I really hope the viewers, decide to pick up this book, because what excited me when you were recuperating in the hospital and I started looking at your stories, I don't even remember exactly what drew me to them. I felt, you'd been through so much, and our family had been through so much, and I just was wanting to remind myself of, I guess, a before time. And I read early stories of yours, and they were incredibly free.
This was a way
they felt really, really free.
Get around
somebody finding
shy.
a voice, and it didn't sound like anyone else's voice.
I might not have been able to say in conversation, and certainly in public. I don't think I could have shouted fire in a crowded theater to save everyone's life. It would be too embarrassing, too humiliating, like getting up in front of Anatol's class and speaking. But writing, you have a lot of courage when you're writing, and you're fearless. Nobody has to read it, perhaps, and maybe nobody ever will, but you are free, and you're free to write anything you want, and it's a tremendous feeling of freedom.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like, particularly because we write fiction, it's almost like we have those Wonder Woman bracelets.
No, and
power.
Sometimes
this is, I can say anything, and some of it might have come from my experience, and some of it didn't. But it shouldn't matter.
Has that willing
which part did and
suspension
which
of
part
disbelief
didn't.
that the reader. It's thrilling when a reader thinks that this is autobiographical, even when it's not. They're so persuaded by it. That's a very gratifying moment. And when my first novel came out, which was called Ending, and which was about the death of a young man, I gave a reading from it. And after the reading, Dad and I were standing around talking to people, and a woman came up and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. How long have you been widowed?" And I was just thrilled that she was convinced that this was a true story. And Dad was less than thrilled. No, my first reading was in Anatol's workshop, but
speaking of readings,
yes.
So did you give your first reading at Bread Loaf?
Frightening too. My heart was just pounding away because the audience.
Oh, a public reading, like with an audience? This was a very
special audience. These were readers, but they were also writers, and many of them were serious writers and writers whose work I had admired tremendously, like Stanley Elkin and Howard Nemeroff and John Gardner. This was just an amazing, I couldn't even believe I was sitting on the porch having a drink with them before the reading. And I certainly needed one after the reading. Did I read that passage well?
Did you, are you a better reader now?
You told me to be slow. Was I slow enough?
Times?
You told me to read it slowly.
Yes, you did. You did. Yeah, so I did an event at Symphony Space at the Thalia Book Club for my last novel, The Female Persuasion, and they brought in the actress Maggie Siff, who's on Billions, and she read this character in my book, Faith Frank, and it was already slower and better than any way I'd ever read in my life, and I was reminded to go slow, and I sometimes will write it across the top of a manuscript page, but I never seem to remember to look.
We happen to have books published at the same time, and our publishers got the bright idea of sending us out together, and we were reading in a restaurant. And during your reading, two men had a terrific fight. And during my reading, a baby sobbed uncontrollably and was never taken out.
Well, as I said, your work is very moving. Well, so shall we turn it to are there some questions?
Yes.
Marjorie asks,
Meg,
are you each other's first readers?
We're early readers, and we are both honest and charitable.
Yes, without a doubt. Yes, it's very, very exciting because you know that the person is waiting. It's sort of like waiting for a date by the phone. They're waiting to hear from you about what you thought about their work. And we know with each of us that we're not going to keep the other one waiting.
Nice.
Yes.
Lisa Sharkey asks, Hilma,
well,
do you see that your influence in Meg's writing? I guess that could be posed the other way around too.
Genetics and living together. I think Meg was a born writer. I think she would have been a writer even if I had abandoned her and given her up. to another family, she still would have been a writer. But I see a similarity in our sense of humor and some aspects of our sensibility. She began writing very young. She was precocious, and I mean, Meg published her first novel when she was 22. She did establish herself as a writer first, and then married and had a family. I married and had a family when I was 22, and didn't have a first book until I was 44, exactly double her age, which I think is significant. She missed her deadline, yes.
Yeah, and our family joke was that my grandmother, your mother, was going to publish her first novel at 88, right?
And we're not a mother-daughter book.
Deadline, yes. And when you said about living together, I'd just like to clarify that we don't live together.
We don't
this
even
is not
live
Grey
near
Gardens.
each other.
Okay. Big Edie and little Edie writing their separate novels in different messages. Not anymore. No.
So I'd like to toss in a question of, you were talking about moving from dream to dream and your characters kind of being with you, but you're not necessarily clearly seeing where they're going. They're there. Do they ever show up and say, my story is a short story, or my story is a novel?
Question.
Or how do you know whether a character walks into your head?
And actually believing that the short story was the apprenticeship of a writer. I no longer believe that after reading Alice Munro and Grace Paley and Chekhov. I understand that the short story is a very complex and beautiful form itself. But I thought that the short story was your apprenticeship, your adolescence, and your maturity was the novel. But also, and I didn't really know the difference, except that the novel was longer. It took me a while to realize that the novel was also wider, and that more points of view might come in. And even if they didn't, even if it was a first-person narrative, characters appear and have more importance. Peripheral characters are no longer peripheral. They enter the main scene more. And that became my version of the difference between the short story and the novel. And for a long time, I only wrote short stories. And then an editor at a very good publisher, a very good literary magazine, asked if I had a novel. And I felt, gee, I'll write one. And I did. And it got published. And then I just began writing novels for a long time after that. And it was so good to get back to the short story. I can't tell you, I think when I started to write The Great Escape, the final story in the collection, I knew that it wasn't going to be a novel. First of all, I'm 91, I'm not that ambitious. And second of all, I knew for the first time how it was going to end. And I just had to see how long it would take to get me there. And it was longer than most of my stories are, interestingly enough. It was, I think, just under 30 pages, which for me is quite long for a short story. Meg, what's your experience with that?
I have published a few short stories in my time, and I edited the Best American Short Stories a few years ago. So I certainly have trafficked in and loved and continue to love short stories. And again, as I said, reading this, I feel that really, you are a master of this, of economy, wit, but also something reaching a point without, shoving it in the reader's face. You're heading somewhere in these stories very deliberately. And I admire that so much. But as when I was in college and taking a lot of writing workshops, everybody wrote short stories. If you wrote a novel in a writing workshop, it kind of got short shrift because you could only kind of give the opening. And then if people said, well, it should do this, your excuse was, yeah, it's going to do that later. So you can't criticize me because it's going to get there. So I think it, just as a as to get the most out of the workshop, I stayed with writing short stories until I began writing my novel. And I felt sort of more at home in a novel than I did writing short stories. I think you are much more ambidextrous, Mom. You are much more ambidextrous than I. I really feel like I want to, and maybe it's because I feel the novel is sometimes, only sometimes, more forgiving, that you can take side trips. And it's hard to take a side trip in a short story, although Alice Munro has, created a new idea of how expansive and how time can pass in a short story. I feel that I'm a more natural novelist,
covering
and
an
you are
entire
both.
lifetime in
Naturally,
a story.
both.
And Virginia Woolf in Mrs. Dalloway having a novel take place in one day. So time isn't necessarily the driving force in the choice between writing a novel or writing a short story. You suddenly know when to stop.
And they can be so different. I know you've spoken a lot about Grace Paley and how important she was to you, but I hadn't read anything like Grace Paley before I read her. Had you?
In the late 50s, early 60s. And what she did was give me permission to write in the voice of a neighborhood, local voices, which was wonderful. And also domestic stories. She and Jane Austen. These are stories that take place mostly within households, and yet they're very large in terms of political content because they tell you what the lives of women and men are like in particular eras. In Georgian times, women couldn't inherit from their fathers. They had to marry. That's why the story of marriages and setting people up was so urgent in Jane Austen. Mrs. Bennet dying to marry off her daughters because otherwise they were going to work as governesses, or as I later found out, as prostitutes. That doesn't appear in Jane Austen, but that was one of the alternatives. A nephew could inherit from a woman's father, but the woman couldn't inherit. Amazing. So women's lives interest me, men's lives too. The lives between men and women and children, family dynamics, interest me tremendously. The shifting of power, the power struggle, the way we want to live within a small group, the way we're moved to live that way, interests me very much.
There's a question here from Lonnie Reed who says, your 70s stories seem to resonate with contemporary women in terms of how they're called up to manage current events. Any thoughts on why?
To relate to a story doesn't mean you have to relate to the period. Otherwise, you couldn't read Jane Austen and enjoy it so much. I think you have to relate to the characters, and the characters have to tell you some truth about their inner lives, about their desire. And you recognize this as something that you feel too. And hello, Lonnie. Lonnie Reed is a friend, actually.
Heller McAlpin, in a review on NPR on their website the other day, Heller McAlpin, the critic, said that this title, Today a Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket, maybe, I think, the best title of the year, or one of the best titles of the year, or something like that. And I think so too. I love this title. I remember as a child when you published the story being a little frightened by the title. Could a mother go mad in a supermarket? What does that mean? And I think that what you did here, what you do in this collection is take these domestic settings and show why they matter.
So big, I never thought
what happens in a supermarket between people. It was fine as a title. Do you want to talk a little bit about that title story before we close up?
I felt that story, the title meant two things, and it was very specific, very real. A woman does have a nervous breakdown in the aisle of a supermarket, but it's also metaphorical because where else would a woman go mad but in a supermarket with all that domestic clutter around her, those cans and those bloody cuts of meat and so forth and so on, all the things that are so important to feeding your family, to cleaning your house, to keeping things together. And because I was a housewife, raised by a housewife to be a housewife, I was very interested in that kind of domestic chaos. And that's why it took place in a supermarket. Maybe I thought I would go mad in one too, until I figured out I could write about it instead.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very, very glad you did. And I'm so glad that these stories are finding new readers now. The reception has been incredible. It's just wonderful to see that happen, because they're, you know, it's just all deserved. These are gems,
Person
these stories.
met in the street.
You know, obviously there's a little nepotistic thing going on here, but honestly, just as a detached writer, I absolutely admire these. That's right. I admire them and you tremendously.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. I think that's an ideal place to wrap up, unless there's anything else you'd like to toss into the conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. On behalf of the library, and I'm sure all of us, Meg Wolitzer, Hilma Wolitzer, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Terrific thoughts. It's been wonderful.